the quiet, unassuming town of Willowbrook, where the streets are lined with mom and pop stores, and traditions run as deep as the roots of the old oak trees, one place stood as both a landmark and a legacy: Harper's Grill. For decades, it had been the town's heart, a place where families gathered for Sunday breakfast and friends caught up over steaming cups of coffee. But behind its cheery red and white facade and comforting aroma of fried bacon and pancakes, Harper's Grill also carried the weight of the past, a past tied to unspoken rules and unyielding prejudices. It was here, on an ordinary afternoon, that the spark of change was ignited, a moment of confrontation between old beliefs and unshakable dignity sent shockwaves through Willowbrook. What began as a single act of injustice inside Harper's Grill would soon ripple far beyond its doors, unraveling secrets, dividing families, and forcing an entire community to question its identity. This is the story of a diner, a man's quiet resilience, a granddaughter's courage, and a town on the brink of transformation. A story that reminds us that sometimes the smallest acts can bring about the biggest changes. The small brass bell above the door of Harper's Grill jingled as Robert Daniels stepped inside, his boots scuffing lightly against the worn linoleum floor. Dressed in a crisp button-down shirt and a veteran's cap adorned with medals, Robert carried himself with quiet pride. He was no stranger to this town, though the years had taken him away to battlefields far from Willowbrook. Now he was back, hoping to reconnect with the place he once called home. The smell of fresh coffee and sizzling burgers filled the air, but the atmosphere was far from welcoming. Conversations hushed, eyes turned, and the hum of the diner dulled into an uneasy silence. Robert noticed the stares, but kept his focus steady, scanning the room for an open seat. Near the window, where sunlight spilled in over the checkered tablecloths, he found one and settled in, resting his hands on the table as he waited for a menu. Behind the counter, Walter Graves, the owner of Harper's Grill, leaned back against the soda fountain, his sharp eyes narrowing as they fixed on Robert. Walter was a man set in his ways, his worldview as rigid as the diner's no-nonsense menu. He folded his arms across his chest and exchanged a knowing look with one of the regulars perched on a stool. "Who does he think he is, walking in here like that?" Walter muttered, his voice low but dripping with disdain. Lila Graves, Walter's 17-year-old granddaughter, was clearing tables nearby. She froze mid-step, her gaze darting between her grandfather and the man at the window. There was something about Robert's quiet presence that struck her. His calm dignity, the way he held himself despite the pointed looks from the other patrons. As Lila approached the counter to grab another tray, she overheard her grandfather's next words. "I'll take care of this." Walter strode across the diner, his boots clicking against the floor. The room seemed to hold its breath as he reached Robert's table. Without so much as a greeting, Walter slapped his hand against the back of a nearby chair, drawing Robert's attention. "Sorry," Walter said, his voice as cold as the iced tea in the pitchers behind the counter. "You can't sit here." Robert looked up, his expression calm but questioning. "Excuse me?" Walter's lips curled into a tight, condescending smile. "People like you don't belong here." The words hung in the air, heavy and unmistakable. A murmur ran through the diner, but no one dared to intervene. Lila, still holding the tray, felt her face flush with embarrassment and anger. She couldn't believe what she was hearing. Robert leaned back slightly, folding his hands in his lap. "I'm just here for a meal," he said evenly. "Nothing more, nothing less." Walter chuckled, a hollow sound. "You think serving in the military means anything to me? You can take that self-righteous pride somewhere else. Not in my diner." A sharp intake of breath came from the back of the room. Lila's tray clattered onto the counter as she stepped forward, her voice trembling but clear. "Grandpa, stop!" Walter turned to her, his brows furrowing. "Leela, this isn't your place to speak. But it is my place to stand up for what's right," she said, her voice growing steadier. "You can't treat someone like this just because of the color of their skin. He served this country." The room grew tense. Some patrons avoided eye contact. Others glanced between Walter and Lila, unsure whether to speak up or stay silent. Walter's face hardened. "You don't understand the way things work, Lila. This is our family's diner, and I have the right to decide who gets served. And you're deciding to humiliate someone who's done more for this country than most of us ever will." Lila shot back, her hands shaking. "What kind of legacy is that?" Robert stood then, his chair scraping softly against the floor. He looked at Lila, a hint of gratitude in his eyes, before turning back to Walter. "There's a cost to everything," he said quietly, his voice steady. "And you'll pay it one day." Without another word, Robert turned and walked out, his steps deliberate and composed. The brass bell jingled again as the door swung shut behind him. Lila felt a swell of anger and shame as she watched him leave. She turned back to her grandfather, who was staring out the window with a look of defiance. "You're wrong," she said softly but firmly, her voice carrying an undeniable weight. "And I won't stay silent about this." That evening, in the privacy of her room, Lila opened her phone and began typing. Her hands shook as she recounted the events of the day, every detail etched into her memory. When she hit post, she didn't know how far her words would spread, or the storm they would unleash. But she knew one thing for certain: silence was no longer an option. The air in Willowbrook was unusually charged the morning after Lila Graves's social media post. It was a post written with raw emotion, detailing her grandfather's actions at Harper's Grill and the quiet dignity with which Robert Daniels had left the diner. It wasn't just a recount of events. It was a heartfelt condemnation of injustice that hit like a thunderclap in the otherwise sleepy town. Lila's words resonated deeply. "Yesterday, I witnessed my own grandfather humiliate a man who served this country simply because of the color of his skin. I can't stay silent. Racism has no place in my family, in our diner, or in this town." It wasn't long before the post spread, first among her classmates, then through the broader town. By dawn, local activists were sharing it, and within 24 hours, the post had taken on a life of its own, garnering thousands of likes and shares across platforms. Comments flooded in, some applauding her bravery, others decrying her betrayal of family. The town itself became a microcosm of the larger cultural divide sweeping the nation. On one side were those who supported Walter Graves, defending his right to run his business as he saw fit. They argued that he shouldn't be forced to serve anyone he didn't want to, couching their justifications in terms of freedom and tradition. On the other side stood a growing movement rallying around Robert Daniels. They saw his treatment at the diner as emblematic of a deeper systemic problem, one that needed to be uprooted. Robert Daniels sat in his modest home on the edge of Willowbrook, the quiet hum of his old refrigerator, the only sound in the room. He held a faded photograph of himself in uniform, taken decades earlier, alongside his platoon. Black and white faces stood side by side, united by something greater than their differences. He stared at the picture, memories flooding back. The camaraderie he'd shared with those men, the moments of laughter and terror on the battlefield. Out there, race hadn't mattered. They'd fought for each other, bled for each other. Yet here, in the country he'd given so much to, he couldn't even sit down for a meal without being told he didn't belong. His thoughts turned to his late wife, Martha. She had always been his source of strength, urging him to remain hopeful, despite the prejudices they faced. "Dignity isn't given, Robert," she used to say. "You carry it with you no matter what." He could almost hear her voice now, reminding him that while Walter's words had been cutting, they didn't define him. Still, the incident lingered like a wound that refused to heal. As the town debated and divided over what had happened, Robert wondered, was this just another moment that would fade away, or could it spark something more lasting? Hundreds of miles away, in a bustling city office, Michael Daniels, Robert's son, scrolled through his phone. The headline on a friend's forwarded link caught his attention. "Veteran denied service at diner. Granddaughter speaks out against racism." Michael's jaw tightened as he read the article. His father's name jumped off the screen, and with it, the details of what had happened at Harper's Grill. The journalist had quoted from Lila's post, weaving a narrative of a small-town confrontation with racism that was all too familiar to Michael. A prominent civil rights activist and organizer, Michael had spent years fighting these battles in cities and towns across the country. But this was personal. It wasn't just about his father. It was about the deep-rooted prejudices that had always lurked in the shadows of Willowbrook, the town where he'd grown up. Michael sat back, closing his eyes. Memories of his childhood in Willowbrook flooded back. The whispered comments, the sideways glances, the times he'd been made to feel less than. He'd left that town for a reason, vowing to build a life where he wouldn't have to endure that quiet but insidious prejudice. But now, his father needed him. And maybe, just maybe, Willowbrook needed him too. Picking up his phone, Michael dialed his assistant. "Cancel my meetings for the next week," he said, his voice firm. "I'm going home." The divide in Willowbrook deepened as Lila's post reached more people. Town hall meetings became battlegrounds for heated debates, and even local businesses couldn't escape the tension. A hardware store owner placed a sign in his window that read, "We stand with Harper's Grill," while the bakery down the street countered with a sign that read, "Justice for Robert Daniels." Social media became a war zone, with hashtags like #Justice for Robert trending alongside #Protect Harper's legacy. Families argued at dinner tables. Friends found themselves on opposite sides of the issue. Walter Graves, for his part, remained defiant. Sitting in his office at the back of the diner, he fumed as he scrolled through the comments on Lila's post. Traitor. Ungrateful. Just another kid brainwashed by the media. The words from his supporters provided little comfort, though, as the negative comments vastly outnumbered the positive ones. Meanwhile, Harper's Grill saw its usual crowd dwindle. Regulars who had once frequented the diner found themselves uneasy about crossing the threshold. Some feared backlash. Others, silently grappling with their own beliefs, felt too conflicted to enter. Walter's longtime friend, Paul Rogers, stopped by one evening, hoping to talk some sense into him. "Walt, you've known me my whole life," Paul said, settling into one of the diner's worn leather booths. "You've always been a stubborn man. But this is different. You're digging yourself into a hole you might not get out of." Walter bristled, shaking his head. "You don't understand, Paul. This is my diner, my family's legacy. I'm not letting anyone take that away from me." "Your family's legacy," Paul said, leaning forward. "Your granddaughter's out there, fighting for what's right, and you're clinging to something that's tearing your family apart. What kind of legacy is that?" Walter didn't have an answer. He stared out the window, the quiet hum of the fluorescent lights above him, amplifying the weight of Paul's words. By the time Michael Daniels arrived in Willowbrook, The town was buzzing. His reputation preceded him. He was known not only for his eloquence and leadership, but also for his ability to organize and inspire change. The first thing he did was visit his father. The two embraced tightly, the silence between them speaking volumes. Michael didn't ask how Robert was feeling. He already knew. Instead, he said, "We're going to make this right, Dad." The following evening, Michael hosted a meeting in the local community center. Activists, young and old, filled the room, alongside a handful of residents who were quietly curious. Michael stood at the front, his voice calm but commanding. "This isn't just about my father," he began. "This is about every person in this town who's ever been made to feel less than. It's about ensuring that no one else has to endure what he went through. Change doesn't come easy, but it starts here, with all of us." The room erupted in applause. People left the meeting galvanized, ready to stand with Michael and Robert. A protest was already in the works, and as the news spread, it became clear that Harper's Grill was about to become the epicenter of a battle much larger than its four walls. The morning light spilled over Willowbrook, illuminating a town now consumed by whispers, debates, and quiet reflection. In a matter of days, the incident at Harper's Grill had transformed from a private humiliation into a public reckoning. What had started as a single social media post by Lila Graves had spiraled into a movement, forcing Willowbrook's residents to confront the deep-seated biases that had been swept under the rug for decades. Tensions bubbled over as the town splintered into two distinct camps. At the local diner, coffee cups clinked while heated discussions filled the air. "Walter has every right to decide who he serves," barked Jim Harlow, a longtime patron of Harper's Grill. "It's his business, his rules." Across the table, Mary Olson, a retired teacher, leaned forward, her voice sharp. "And what about basic decency? Robert Daniels is a veteran, Jim. A man who fought for this country deserves respect." Similar arguments echoed in grocery store aisles, church pews, and high school hallways. Families were divided, neighbors stopped speaking, and old friendships frayed under the strain of opposing viewpoints. On social media, the debate raged even more fiercely. Supporters of Walter Graves rallied around hashtags like #Harper's Rights and #Defend Tradition. Meanwhile, those standing with Robert Daniels flooded timelines with #Justice for Robert and #End Racism in Willowbrook. The hashtags told two distinct stories, each side digging in deeper, unwilling to yield. Walter Graves sat alone in his office at Harper's Grill, staring at the framed photograph of his father, Henry Graves, who had opened the diner nearly 50 years ago. In the black and white photo, Henry stood in front of the newly minted Harper's Grill sign, a broad smile on his face. Walter's jaw tightened. This was his legacy, his family's legacy. How could anyone understand the weight of preserving something so integral to his identity? When Paul Rogers visited again, Walter's stubbornness showed no signs of softening. "I'm not apologizing," Walter snapped, slamming his fist on the desk. "This is my diner. It's always been my diner. I don't care what the town or that boy Michael Daniels has to say." Paul sighed, rubbing his temples. "Walt, this isn't just about you anymore. It's about what this place represents to the community. And right now, it's not looking good." "I won't be bullied," Walter shot back, his voice rising. "Let them protest. Let them shout. I've stood my ground before, and I'll do it again." But as Paul left, Walter couldn't shake the growing unease gnawing at the edges of his resolve. Outside his office, the once bustling diner sat eerily quiet, the few remaining patrons casting uneasy glances toward the door. Michael Daniels wasted no time mobilizing the community. His meeting at the community center had been just the beginning. Over the next few days, he met with local activists, clergy members, and even high school students, urging them to take a stand. At one gathering, Michael addressed a group of young people who had never participated in activism before. "Change doesn't come from silence," he said, pacing the room. "It comes from courage. Every voice in this town matters, yours included. We're not just fighting for my father. We're fighting for a better future for all of us." The group nodded, their initial apprehension giving way to determination. Among them was Lila Graves, her youthful face set with a mix of resolve and guilt. She approached Michael after the meeting, her voice barely above a whisper. "Mr. Daniels," she began, I don't know how to fix this. My grandfather, he's always been so proud of the diner, but now—" Michael placed a reassuring hand on her shoulder. "Lila, the fact that you're here, willing to stand up for what's right, means more than you know. Change often starts with the younger generation. Your voice matters." Lila nodded, her confidence growing. "I'll do whatever it takes," she said firmly. As protests loomed, Willowbrook's town hall meetings became powder kegs of emotion. On one side, residents like Jim Harlow and a few of Walter's longtime customers argued for the sanctity of property rights and tradition. "This is about a man's right to run his business without interference," Jim shouted, his voice echoing in the packed room. "You can't force someone to go against their beliefs." On the other side, voices like Mary Olson and Reverend James Carter, a local pastor, called for justice and accountability. "Beliefs rooted in hatred have no place in this town," Reverend Carter declared, his voice steady but impassioned. "This isn't just about one man's diner. It's about the soul of Willowbrook." At the center of the storm was Walter, who attended one of the meetings at Paul Rogers' urging. His presence only inflamed tensions, with angry shouts erupting from both sides of the room. Walter sat stoically, his face a mask of defiance, but the weight of the accusations clearly took its toll. When the meeting adjourned, Walter left without a word, his shoulders slumped under the weight of the town's judgment. Meanwhile, Robert Daniels kept a low profile, avoiding the chaos consuming the town. He spent his days volunteering at the local library and Veterans Center, trying to focus on anything but the incident. But no matter where he went, whispers followed. One afternoon, a young boy approached him at the library, clutching a history book. "Mr. Daniels," the boy asked shyly, "is it true you were a soldier?" Robert smiled gently. "That's right, son. I served a long time ago." The boy's eyes widened. "My dad says you're really brave." Robert's throat tightened, and he placed a hand on the boy's shoulder. "Thank you," he said softly. "But bravery isn't about what you do on the battlefield. It's about standing up for what's right, no matter where you are." As the week progressed, it became clear that the town was heading toward a showdown. Protest signs began appearing in front yards. Businesses displayed their allegiances in their windows, and whispers of a large-scale demonstration spread through the community. In the midst of this brewing storm, Michael Daniels called for a peaceful protest to be held outside Harper's Grill. "We will stand together," he announced in a video posted to social media. "Not with anger, but with purpose. This is about justice, dignity, and the kind of town we want Willowbrook to be." The video quickly went viral, drawing attention from beyond Willowbrook's borders. Activists from neighboring towns pledged their support, and even a few national figures weighed in, further polarizing the community. As pressure mounted, Walter found himself increasingly isolated. Loyal customers stopped visiting, old friends avoided his calls, and even his staff began to question whether they wanted to be associated with Harper's Grill. One evening, Walter sat alone in the empty diner. The faint hum of the fluorescent lights, the only sound. He stared out the window at the street, where a small group of protesters had already begun to gather, their signs illuminated by the glow of streetlights. For the first time, doubt began to creep into his mind. Was he truly protecting his family's legacy, or was he clinging to something that no longer served the community he claimed to love? The morning of the protest dawned with a quiet stillness, the air in Willowbrook charged with anticipation. The streets, usually calm and unremarkable, now hummed with activity. Cars lined the roads leading to Harper's Grill, their drivers spilling out, carrying handmade signs, their expressions a mix of determination and nervous energy. This wasn't just another day in Willowbrook. It was a reckoning. By 9 a.m., the crowd outside Harper's Grill had grown into a vibrant sea of people. Signs reading "Equality for All" and "No Place for Hate" rose above the crowd, their bold letters cutting through the tension in the air. A diverse group had gathered: veterans, students, clergy, and families, all united in their demand for justice. Michael Daniels stood at the forefront, his calm demeanor exuding a quiet strength. With a megaphone in hand, he addressed the crowd. "This isn't just about my father," he began, his voice clear and resolute. "This is about every person who has ever been told they don't belong, who has been denied dignity simply because of who they are. Today we stand together to say, enough." The crowd erupted into cheers, the sound reverberating through the streets. Among them stood Lila Graves, holding a sign she had painted the night before, that read, "Justice for Robert." Her hands trembled slightly, but her resolve was unwavering. "I'm here because it's the right thing to do," she told a reporter from the local news station, her voice firm, despite the cameras pointed at her. "We can't let prejudice define our town anymore." Inside Harper's Grill, Walter Graves watched the scene unfold through the blinds. His hands trembled as he gripped the counter, his jaw set, in a mixture of anger and fear. The sight of the protesters, many of whom were once his loyal customers, felt like a betrayal. But what stung the most was seeing Lila among them, her youthful face filled with determination. "She's just a kid," he muttered to himself, shaking his head. "What does she know about the world?" Paul Rogers entered the diner, his expression grim. "Walt, it's getting bigger out there," he said, nodding toward the growing crowd. "You need to say something. Anything." Walter's face darkened. "What am I supposed to say, Paul? That I'm sorry for standing my ground? That I'll let them take everything I've worked for?" Paul sighed, leaning against the counter. "It's not about losing the diner, Walt. It's about losing the respect of this town. And your family." Walter said nothing, his silence heavy with defiance and doubt. As the morning wore on, the protest swelled. More people arrived, many from neighboring towns, drawn by social media and news coverage of the incident. A counter-protest soon emerged, a smaller but vocal group, waving signs with slogans like "Stand with Walter" and "Tradition Matters." The two groups faced each other across the street, the tension palpable. Shouts and chants overlapped, creating a chaotic symphony of voices. "You can't bully a man out of his own business," shouted a counter-protester, his face red with anger. "And you can't deny a man his dignity," a protester shot back, her voice sharp and unwavering. Police officers arrived to maintain order, their presence adding to the charged atmosphere. Officers stood between the groups, their expressions wary as they scanned the crowd for any signs of violence. Amid the cacophony, Lila stepped forward, her sign held high. "Grandpa," she shouted, her voice carrying over the noise, "come out here and face us." The crowd quieted slightly, turning their attention toward the diner, Inside, Walter froze, her words cutting through him like a knife. For a moment, he considered staying hidden, but something in her voice compelled him to move. Walter stepped to the window, peering out at his granddaughter. Her face was a mixture of sadness and determination. Her eyes locked on his. She lowered her sign, her voice trembling but resolute. "This isn't who we are," she said, her words directed at him, but loud enough for the crowd to hear. "This diner was built to bring people together, not tear them apart. Please, Grandpa, do the right thing." The crowd murmured in agreement, the weight of Lila's words hanging in the air. The counter-protesters, however, were not swayed. A burly man in a flannel shirt stepped forward, his face twisted with anger. "Don't let them guilt you, Walter," he shouted. "You've got the right to serve whoever you want." Michael Daniels stepped up, his calm presence silencing the crowd. "This isn't about rights," he said, his voice steady. "It's about what's right. Mr. Graves has the power to make a choice that defines not just this diner, but this entire town." The man in the flannel shirt sneered. "Easy for you to say. You're just here to stir the pot." Michael's gaze didn't waver. "I'm here because my father was humiliated, in a place he fought to protect. If standing up for dignity and equality stirs the pot, then so be it." The crowd erupted into applause, drowning out the counter-protesters' jeers. The balance of power was shifting, and the protesters' unity began to eclipse the opposition's anger. Back inside the diner, Walter sank into a chair, his head in his hands. The voices outside, Michael's, Lila's, the protesters, swirled in his mind, each one chipping away at the wall of pride he had built around himself. He thought of his father, Henry Graves, and the stories he used to tell about the early days of Harper's Grill. "This place is for everyone," Henry had said. "Doesn't matter where they're from or what they look like. A full stomach and a kind word go a long way." Had he forgotten those words, or had he twisted them into something his father would never have recognized? Walter's thoughts were interrupted by the sound of a rock hitting the diner's window. He looked up to see a young man from the counter-protest side, his face contorted in anger as he hurled another rock toward the glass. Outside, the crowd gasped, and the police moved quickly to intervene. The momentary chaos only deepened Walter's sense of unease. This wasn't just about him anymore. It was about the soul of the town, and whether he had the strength to save it. As the sun began to set, casting a golden glow over the scene, the protesters lit candles, their flames flickering in the evening breeze. Michael Daniels stood at the center, his voice rising above the crowd. "We're not here to fight," he said. "We're here to heal. This is our chance to show that Willowbrook is better than hate, that we can rise above our differences and build something greater together." The crowd responded with chants of "Justice for Robert," their voices harmonizing in a powerful crescendo. Inside the diner, Walter watched in silence, the glow of the candles reflected in his eyes. For the first time, he felt a flicker of doubt, not about the protesters, but about himself. Could he change? Could he find a way to honor his father's legacy while letting go of the hatred that had consumed him? The answer, he realized, would not come easily, but it was a question he could no longer ignore. The echoes of the protest outside Harper's Grill still lingered in the small town of Willowbrook. Even though the crowd had dispersed, their chants and candlelit resolve hung in the air like an unspoken challenge. Inside his diner, Walter Graves sat alone in the dim light, staring at the framed photographs lining the walls. Each picture told a story: his father shaking hands with customers, families laughing over meals, a young Walter standing proudly at his father's side. But now, those memories felt distant, as if they belonged to someone else, Walter's hands trembled as he picked up a black and white photograph of his father, Henry Graves. The elder Graves had built Harper's Grill with his bare hands, turning it into a gathering place for the community. "This diner is for everyone, Walt," his father used to say. "People come here to forget their troubles, to feel at home. Never let them leave without a smile." Walter sighed, his chest heavy with regret. Somewhere along the way, he had lost sight of his father's vision. He had let fear and prejudice take root, twisting the diner's legacy into something his father would never have wanted. The protest, the chants, Lila's defiance, it all felt like a reckoning, one he wasn't sure he could face. The sound of a knock at the door pulled him from his thoughts. He turned to see Paul Rogers, his oldest friend, standing on the other side of the glass. "Mind if I come in?" Paul asked, stepping inside without waiting for an answer. Walter gestured to a chair across the counter. "Suit yourself." Paul sat down, his eyes scanning the diner. "This place has seen better days," he remarked, his tone heavy with meaning. Walter scoffed, pouring 2 cups of coffee. "I suppose you're here to tell me what I've done wrong, like everyone else." Paul took the cup, but didn't drink. "I'm not here to lecture you, Walt. I'm here because I've known you long enough to see when you're drowning. And right now, you're sinking fast." Walter bristled. "I'm standing my ground, defending what's mine. That's not sinking, that's surviving." Paul leaned forward, his voice quiet but firm. "Your father didn't build this diner on pride, Walt. He built it on community. And right now, you've turned it into a battleground." Across town, Robert Daniels sat on a bench at the Willowbrook Veterans Memorial. The sun dipped low in the skies, casting long shadows over the granite slabs, engraved with the names of local men and women who had served their country. Robert's name was there too, etched among the fallen and the survivors. But today, the sight brought him no comfort. He ran a hand over the smooth surface of the stone, his mind drifting back to his days in the military. He remembered the bonds he had formed with his fellow soldiers, men and women of all backgrounds who had fought side by side, united by a common purpose. On the battlefield, there were no divisions, no colors, only comrades. Yet here, in the town he had fought to protect, he was made to feel like an outsider. "Was it all for nothing?" he whispered, his voice breaking. "Did we sacrifice so much, only to come home to this?" The weight of the question bore down on him. But before despair could take hold, a familiar voice called out, "Dad." Robert turned to see Michael approaching, his silhouette framed by the warm glow of the setting sun. The younger Daniels carried the same determination that had fueled the protest, but his eyes softened as he approached his father. "Mind if I sit?" Michael asked. Robert nodded, and Michael took a seat beside him. For a moment, neither spoke, the silence filled with unspoken pain and shared understanding. Finally, Michael broke the silence. "I saw the memorial on the news last week. People all over the country talking about the sacrifices made here. About you." Robert chuckled bitterly. "Sacrifices that don't mean a damn thing in a place like this." Michael placed a hand on his father's shoulder. "They mean everything, Dad. That's why we're fighting. Not just for you, but for everyone who's ever been told they don't belong." Robert looked at his son, his eyes filled with both pride and sorrow. "I just hope it's worth it, Michael. Hope this town is ready to change." Later that evening, Michael found himself at Willowbrook Park, sitting on a bench near the playground. The protest had taken its toll, and he needed a moment to clear his mind. But he wasn't alone for long. Lila Graves approached hesitantly, clutching a notebook against her chest. "Michael?" she said softly, her voice tinged with uncertainty. He looked up, surprised to see her. "Lila, What brings you here? She shifted nervously, then sat down beside him. I wanted to talk to you. About everything. Michael nodded, sensing the weight of her words. Go on. Lila took a deep breath, her fingers fidgeting with the edges of her notebook. I don't know how to fix this. My family, this town, it feels like everything's broken. And I don't know if standing up to my grandfather made things better or worse. Michael placed a reassuring hand on her shoulder. Change is never easy, Lila. It's messy and painful, but it's necessary. What you did took courage. And sometimes, the first step is the hardest. Leila looked at him, her eyes searching for answers. Do you think he'll ever change? Michael sighed, his gaze distant. People like your grandfather, they've spent their whole lives believing certain things. Changing that takes time, but it starts with moments like this, with people like you. Back at Harper's Grill, Walter sat in the darkened diner, the coffee in his cup long gone cold. He stared at the door, half expecting someone to walk in and tell him what to do. But no one came. Only his own thoughts remained, swirling like a storm. Paul's words echoed in his mind. Your father didn't build this diner on pride. He glanced again at the photo of his father, his heart heavy with regret. Then, for the first time in years, he whispered a quiet prayer. Dad, if you're listening, tell me what to do. Tell me how to fix this. The sound of the door opening startled him. He looked up to see Robert Daniels standing in the doorway, his expression unreadable. Robert, Walter said, his voice caught between surprise and unease. What are you doing here? Robert stepped inside, his gaze steady. We need to talk, Walter. About the past. About everything. Walter nodded, his throat tight. I don't know if I can fix this. Robert's voice was firm but not unkind. You can start by listening. And so, for the first time, the two men sat down across from each other, not as adversaries, but as two human beings trying to find a way forward. The next morning, Willowbrook awoke to find itself at the center of a storm, brewing far beyond its borders. What began as a local incident at Harper's Grill had transformed overnight into a national conversation. Social media platforms buzzed with outrage, solidarity, and debate, while reporters descended on the small town, eager to capture the story of Robert Daniels, the veteran who had been humiliated in his own community. It started with a headline in a regional paper. Veteran denied service in small-town diner sparks outrage. The article detailed the incident, quoting Lila Graves' now viral post, and Robert Daniels' dignified yet heart-wrenching response. There's a cost to everything. Within hours, national news outlets picked up the story. The image of Robert, standing silently outside Harper's Grill, circulated widely. His calm expression spoke volumes. A man who had given everything for his country, now facing rejection in the very place he called home. Major television networks dispatched their anchors to Willowbrook. The town square became a hub of activity, with camera crews setting up interviews and live broadcasts. Harper's Grill, once just another small-town diner, now stood as a symbol of racial division and a nation's ongoing struggle with equality. Among the journalists clamoring for an interview, one voice stood out. Diane Harper, a respected correspondent known for her thoughtful reporting on social justice issues. Diane reached out to Robert personally, meeting him at the Veterans Memorial, where he often found solace. The interview was simple, yet profoundly moving. As the camera rolled, Diane asked, Mr. Daniels, can you tell us what went through your mind when you were denied service at Harper's Grill? Robert hesitated for a moment, his gaze distant. I thought about the men I served with, he began. On the battlefield, we didn't see skin color. We saw each other, brothers and sisters fighting for the same cause. But here, in the town I've called home for decades, I was reminded that those bonds don't always carry over. Diane leaned forward, her voice soft. Do you think this town can change? Robert met her gaze, his eyes filled with quiet determination. I believe it can, but change doesn't come easy. It takes people willing to stand up and say, this isn't right. That's what my son, Michael, is trying to do. And that's what I hope this moment will inspire. Not just here, but everywhere. While Robert's words resonated across the country, the fallout for Walter Graves was swift and unrelenting. Friends who once frequented Harper's Grill now avoided him, unwilling to be associated with the controversy. The diner, usually bustling with patrons, sat empty. Even his most loyal customers began to drift away, their silence speaking louder than words. Walter's stubbornness, once a source of pride, now felt like a noose tightening around his neck. As he cleaned the empty tables, the sound of the doorbell startled him. He turned, half expecting a customer, but found himself face to face with Margaret, his estranged daughter, and Lila's mother. Margaret, Walter said, his voice cautious. What are you doing here? Margaret stepped inside, her expression a mix of anger and sadness. We need to talk, Dad. About what you've done. Walter bristled. I don't need another lecture. Margaret shook her head, her tone sharp. No. What you need is to listen. Do you have any idea how much damage you've caused? To this family? To Lila? To this town? Walter turned away, his jaw clenched. I'm protecting our legacy. Margaret's voice rose, her frustration spilling over. Legacy? Is this what you think Grandpa would have wanted? A diner that divides instead of bringing people together. Dad, if you keep this up, you're going to lose more than just customers. You're going to lose your family. Meanwhile, Lila found herself thrust into the spotlight as her social media post continued to gain traction. Messages of support poured in from across the country, but so did criticism and threats. Some accused her of betraying her family, while others praised her bravery. One evening, Michael Daniels invited Lila to speak at a town hall meeting he had organized. The event, held at the Willowbrook Community Center, was packed with residents eager to voice their opinions. Cameras from local and national outlets lined the walls, capturing every moment. When it was her turn to speak, Lila hesitated, the weight of the room pressing down on her. But then she saw Robert and Michael in the front row, their presence steady and reassuring. Taking a deep breath, she stepped up to the microphone. I love my grandfather, she began, her voice trembling. But love doesn't mean staying silent when someone you care about is wrong. What happened at Harper's Grill wasn't just about one meal or one person. It was about a mindset, a belief that some people are less deserving of respect and dignity. And that belief has no place in my family or this town. Her words drew applause, but also murmurs of dissent. Still, Lila stood her ground, her voice growing stronger. Change starts with us, with each of us choosing to be better than the generations before us. I believe this town can change, and I believe my grandfather can too. As the media coverage intensified, Harper's Grill became a focal point of both outrage and hope. Protesters gathered outside daily, their numbers swelling with each passing day. Among them were veterans, students, church groups, and families, all united in their call for justice. The pressure on Walter mounted. His phone rang incessantly, reporters and former friends alike, demanding answers. Even Paul Rogers, his oldest friend, began to keep his distance. But it was a letter from Lila that finally broke through the walls Walter had built around himself. Handwritten and heartfelt, it read, Dear Grandpa, I know you think I've turned against you, but I haven't. I still love you. I always will. But love means wanting what's best for someone, even when it's hard. And right now, what's best for you and for all of us is to let go of the anger and fear that's holding you back. You don't have to do this alone. We're here for you. But you have to take the first step. With love, Lila. Walter read the letter over and over, his hands trembling. For the first time in years, he felt the weight of his choices, not just on his business, but on his family and his soul. That night, Walter locked up the diner and stood outside, staring at the weathered sign that bore his father's name. He thought about the man who had built Harper's Grill with love and purpose, who had welcomed everyone with open arms. Slowly, Walter reached up and traced the edges of the sign, his heart heavy with regret. I don't know if I can fix this, he whispered into the quiet night. But maybe it's time I tried. The atmosphere in Willowbrook was electric. The media frenzy and daily protests outside Harper's Grill had pushed the town into a state of constant tension. Yet amidst the division, Michael Daniels saw an opportunity to transform this moment of pain and outrage into lasting change. Michael stood in the living room of his father's modest home, poring over notes and blueprints scattered across the coffee table. He had been working tirelessly since arriving in Willowbrook, meeting with activists, community leaders, and supporters from all over the country. But now, he was ready to unveil his plan. Dad, Michael said, glancing up at Robert, who sat in his favorite armchair. This isn't just about Harper's Grill. It's about what it represents. Robert raised an eyebrow, leaning forward. Go on. Michael took a deep breath. I want to buy the diner. Not just to take it away from Walter, but to turn it into something better. A space where everyone, regardless of race or background, feels welcome. A symbol of what this town could be. Robert's face softened, a hint of pride in his eyes. You've always thought big, son. But do you really think Walter will sell? Michael nodded firmly. With the pressure he's under, I think he'll consider it. But even if he doesn't, we can make this happen. I've already started a fundraising campaign. He handed Robert a flyer with the bold headline, Transforming Harper's Grill into the Freedom Table, a place for all. The flyer outlined Michael's vision, a community diner run by a diverse staff, hosting workshops, town halls, and events that promoted unity and understanding. It wasn't just a restaurant. It was a movement. The next day, Michael held a meeting at the Willowbrook Community Center. The room was packed, with standing room only. Local residents, students, veterans, and even some of the town's more conservative figures had shown up, curious about Michael's proposal. Michael stood at the front of the room, his presence commanding yet approachable. Thank you all for coming, he began. I know this town has been through a lot in the past few weeks, but I believe we're standing at a crossroads. We can let this divide us further, or we can come together to create something meaningful. He paused, letting his words sink in. Harper's Grill has been a symbol of division, but what if we could turn it into a symbol of unity? A place where everyone feels welcome, where we can break bread together and start to heal as a community. The room buzzed with murmurs of agreement. Lila Graves, sitting in the front row, raised her hand. How do we make this happen? Michael smiled. I've already started a crowdfunding campaign. We're asking people to donate what they can. Time, money, even supplies. Every little bit helps. Together, we can make this dream a reality. After the meeting, Michael found Lila waiting for him near the exit. Her young face was earnest, her eyes filled with determination. I want to help, she said. I know my grandfather won't approve, but this is bigger than him. This is about doing what's right. Michael placed a reassuring hand on her shoulder. Your courage inspires me, Lila. You've already done so much just by speaking out. But if you're willing, I'd like you to be a part of the campaign. Your voice matters, especially to the younger generation. Lila nodded, a small smile breaking through her nervousness. I'll do whatever it takes. Over the next few days, Lila became a driving force behind the campaign. She organized a group of her peers to spread the word, using social media to reach audiences far and wide. Together, they created videos, posters, and heartfelt testimonials, painting a vision of hope for Willowbrook. Meanwhile, Walter Graves remained steadfast in his opposition. The growing momentum of Michael's campaign only deepened his resentment. Sitting in the empty diner, he grumbled to Paul Rogers, his oldest friend. They're trying to take everything from me, Walter said, his voice laced with bitterness. First the protests, now this fundraiser. They want to erase my family's legacy. Paul leaned back in his chair, his expression contemplative. Maybe it's not about erasing, Walt. Maybe it's about building something new, something better. Walter slammed his fist on the table. Better? You think turning my diner into some free-for-all is better? This place has been in my family for generations. I'm not giving it up without a fight. Paul sighed, choosing his words carefully. I've known you a long time, Walt, and I've always respected you. But maybe it's time to ask yourself, what's more important? Holding on to this building or holding on to your family? Walter's jaw tightened, but he said nothing. Paul's words struck a chord, though he wasn't ready to admit it. As the days turned into weeks, Michael's fundraising campaign gained momentum. Donations poured in from across the country, many accompanied by heartfelt messages of support. My grandfather was a veteran too. This story hits close to home. Keep fighting the good fight. A place like the Freedom Table is exactly what we need in these divided times. Thank you for standing up for what's right. I'm proud to support this effort. The campaign surpassed its initial goal within days, allowing Michael to expand his vision. He began reaching out to local contractors and designers, ensuring the transformation of Harper's Grill would be both symbolic and practical. One evening, Walter sat alone in the diner, nursing a cup of coffee. He stared at the newspaper on the counter, the front page dominated by an article about Michael's campaign. The headline read, "A Town Divided. Can Willowbrook find unity in the Freedom Table?" For the first time, Walter felt the weight of his decisions pressing down on him. He thought about Lila, her defiance, her courage, and wondered if she was right. Had his stubbornness blinded him to the possibility of something better? That night, Walter didn't sleep. Instead, he sat at his kitchen table, poring over the old photographs of his father and grandfather, men who had built Harper's Grill with dreams of community and connection. Somewhere along the way, Walter realized he had lost sight of that vision. The next morning, Walter called Michael. His voice was strained but sincere. "I want to talk," he said simply. Michael agreed, and the two men met at the diner. The atmosphere was tense, but there was a glimmer of hope in the air. "I'm not ready to let go completely," Walter began. "But I've been thinking, maybe there's a way to honor my family's legacy and your vision." Michael listened intently as Walter proposed a compromise. He would sell the diner to the campaign, but only if the new space honored the history of Harper's Grill while embracing the values of inclusion and unity. Michael extended his hand, a smile breaking across his face. Deal. News of the agreement spread quickly, igniting a wave of excitement and relief. For the first time in weeks, it felt as though Willowbrook was moving toward healing. Volunteers flooded the diner, ready to begin the transformation. Robert Daniels watched from the sidelines, his heart swelling with pride. "This is what we fought for," he said quietly to Michael. "A chance for something better." Michael nodded, his eyes shining with determination. "This is just the beginning, Dad." The tension in Willowbrook was palpable. News of the upcoming public dialogue between Michael Daniels and Walter Graves spread like wildfire, drawing the attention of locals and media alike. For weeks, the town had been caught in the throes of division, but this confrontation promised to be the turning point. Would Walter finally recognize the harm he'd caused? Or would he double down, risking his legacy and his family's respect? The town square buzzed with activity. A makeshift stage had been set up in front of the courthouse, with chairs and benches arranged for spectators. Local news crews positioned their cameras, ensuring the event would be broadcast live. Willowbrook hadn't seen this level of excitement or tension in decades. Robert Daniels stood quietly near the back of the crowd, his presence commanding yet understated. He had insisted on coming, despite Michael's concerns. "This isn't just your fight, son," Robert had said. "It's ours." Lila Graves, sitting near the front with her mother, Margaret, glanced nervously at the stage. She knew how stubborn her grandfather could be, but she also held on to the faint hope that today might mark the beginning of his change. Walter Graves, dressed in his usual plaid shirt and suspenders, stood off to the side of the stage, arms crossed. His face was a mask of defiance, but those closest to him could see the cracks, nervous glances, fidgeting hands, a slight tremor in his voice when he spoke. He was a man wrestling with his conscience, though he'd never admit it. Michael Daniels took the stage first, greeted by cheers and applause. He approached the microphone with calm confidence, his voice steady as he addressed the crowd. "Thank you all for being here today," he began. "This isn't just about my father or Harper's Grill. It's about our community and the values we choose to uphold. Today we have an opportunity to confront our differences, to listen to one another, and to start the process of healing." The crowd responded with applause, though a few skeptical murmurs could be heard from Walter's supporters. Walter stepped onto the stage next, met with a mix of polite claps and silence. He approached his microphone stiffly, his expression betraying the inner turmoil he felt. "This diner," he began, his voice gruff, "has been in my family for 3 generations. It's not just a business, it's a legacy, and I've done my best to protect it." Michael nodded, his tone measured as he replied, "Mr. Graves, I understand how much Harper's Grill means to you, but protecting a legacy shouldn't come at the expense of dignity and respect for others." Walter's jaw tightened. "And who decides what respect means? I have the right to run my diner as I see fit. That's the American way." The dialogue quickly escalated, with Walter defending his actions as a business owner, and Michael challenging him to consider the impact of his decisions on the community. "Your diner isn't just a private business, Mr. Graves," Michael said firmly. "It's a public space. And when you choose to exclude someone based on the color of their skin, you're sending a message to the entire town, a message that some people are less deserving of respect." Walter shot back, his voice rising. "You talk about respect. But what about my rights? What about the values my father taught me? Hard work is loyalty and standing by your beliefs." Michael took a step closer, his voice calm but resolute. "Your father built Harper's Grill to bring people together, not to divide them. Do you really think he would be proud of what it's become?" Walter flinched at the mention of his father, but he quickly masked his discomfort with a scowl. "Don't you dare talk about my father. You don't know anything about him." The tension on stage was palpable, and the crowd watched in silence, hanging on every word. Then, unexpectedly, Lila stood up from her seat, and approached the stage. Her mother called after her, but Lila's resolve was unshakable. "Grandpa," she said, her voice trembling but clear, "I need to say something." Walter turned to her, his eyes narrowing. "Lila, this isn't your place." "No, it is," she interrupted, her voice growing stronger. "Because this is about our family, and it's about the future we're building." Lila turned to the crowd, her words carrying an emotional weight that silenced even the skeptics. "My grandfather raised me to believe in fairness and kindness, but what he did to Mr. Daniels was neither fair nor kind. And if we keep clinging to old prejudices, we're not protecting our legacy. We're destroying it." She looked back at Walter, tears glistening in her eyes. "Please, Grandpa, this isn't who we are. It's not who we should be." Lila's words struck a nerve. Walter's stern expression faltered, his hands trembling, as he gripped the edges of the podium. For the first time, he seemed lost, unsure of how to respond. The crowd held its breath, waiting for his next move. Even Michael stayed silent, sensing that this moment was not his to take. Walter looked down at the stage floor, his voice barely audible. I don't know anymore." The silence was broken by a round of applause, starting with Robert Daniels. Slowly, others joined in, until the entire square was filled with the sound of clapping. It wasn't just a show of support. It was an acknowledgement of the courage it took for Walter to admit his uncertainty. Michael stepped forward, extending a hand to Walter. "Mr. Graves, it's never too late to change. This isn't about tearing down your legacy. It's about building something better together." Walter hesitated, his gaze shifting from Michael to Lila, and finally to Robert, who stood at the back of the crowd, his expression calm and steady. With a deep breath, Walter took Michael's hand. The gesture met with cheers and tears from the audience. The public dialogue ended with a renewed sense of hope. Walter didn't offer an apology that day, but his willingness to listen marked the first step in his journey toward redemption. As the crowd dispersed, Michael and Lila stayed behind to thank the organizers and volunteers. Walter lingered near the stage, watching as his granddaughter spoke with Michael. For the first time in weeks, he felt a glimmer of something he hadn't felt in years. Pride, not in his stubbornness, but in the courage of his family to stand for what was right. The aftermath of the public dialogue left the town of Willowbrook in a fragile balance between hope and skepticism. Walter Graves, once unwavering in his convictions, now stood at a crossroads. His granddaughter's heartfelt plea and Michael Daniels' pointed words echoed in his mind, refusing to fade. For Walter, the days following the dialogue were filled with restless nights and quiet introspection, as he grappled with the weight of his legacy and the possibility of change. Walter sat alone in his dimly lit kitchen, a cup of coffee growing cold on the table in front of him. The silence of the house was deafening, punctuated only by the occasional creak of the old wooden floorboards. Spread out on the table were old photographs and yellowed newspaper clippings, snapshots of Harper's Grill's history, pictures of his father, Henry Graves, shaking hands with locals of all backgrounds, smiling as he served meals to a diverse crowd. Walter's gaze lingered on a photo of his younger self, standing proudly beside his father in front of the diner. His father's words echoed in his memory. "This place is more than a business, son. It's a home for everyone who walks through those doors." The weight of his father's vision contrasted starkly with the reality of the diner today, a place marred by division and controversy. For the first time, Walter felt the cracks in the foundation of the legacy he had fought so hard to protect. Unable to shake the guilt gnawing at him, Walter decided to take a step he'd never imagined, visiting Robert Daniels. Early the next morning, Walter walked to Robert's modest home, his hands trembling as he gripped his hat. Each step felt heavier than the last, the burden of his actions pressing down on him. When Robert opened the door, his expression registered surprise, but he quickly composed himself. "Walter," he said calmly, his tone neutral, but not unkind. "What brings you here?" I need to talk," Walter stammered, his voice unsteady. "May I come in?" Robert hesitated for a moment, before stepping aside. "Come on in." The living room was modest but warm, with family photos adorning the walls. Walter's eyes were drawn to a picture of Robert, in his military uniform, standing proudly with his unit, a diverse group of men and women. It was a stark reminder of the sacrifices Robert had made, sacrifices Walter had callously dismissed. As they sat across from each other, Walter struggled to find the words. "I came to say, I'm sorry," he began, his voice faltering. "I let my pride blind me. I hurt you, and I hurt this town. And for what? To hold on to something that doesn't even feel right anymore." Robert studied Walter for a long moment, his gaze steady. "Apologies are a start," he said finally. "But what matters is what you do next. Words can only go so far." Walter nodded, his shoulders slumping. "I want to make things right. I just don't know how." That evening, Walter called a family meeting. Lila and Margaret arrived at the diner after hours, finding Walter sitting at a corner booth, with a stack of papers in front of him. His usual stern demeanor was softened, replaced by a weariness they hadn't seen before. "I've made a decision," Walter said, his voice steady but tinged with emotion. "I'm going to sell Harper's Grill." Margaret's eyes widened in shock. "Dad, are you sure? This place has been in our family for generations." Walter nodded. "I know, but holding on to it the way I have, it's not what Dad would have wanted. I see that now. It's time for a new chapter, for this diner, and for our family." Layla's eyes filled with tears. "Grandpa, thank you. This means so much, not just to me, but to everyone in this town." Walter placed a hand on the stack of papers. "I've already spoken to Michael Daniels. He and his campaign will take over. But there's one condition. They have to honor our family's legacy. I don't want Harper's Grill to be forgotten." Margaret and Lila exchanged a glance, both nodding in agreement. "We'll make sure of it," Margaret said. The next day, Walter and Michael met at the diner to finalize the sale. The atmosphere was tense but respectful, with both men recognizing the significance of the moment. Walter handed Michael the keys, his hand lingering for a moment before letting go. "This place has been my whole life," Walter said quietly. "I hope you'll take good care of it." Michael nodded, his expression solemn. "We will, and we'll make sure it stands for what it was always meant to be, a place where everyone feels welcome." As a symbolic gesture, Walter helped Michael and a group of volunteers remove the old Harper's Grill sign from above the door. In its place, they planned to install a new sign, the Freedom Table. Later that evening, Walter visited the graveyard where his father was buried. He stood in silence before the gravestone, his hat in his hands. "Dad," he began, his voice breaking. "I'm sorry. I thought I was protecting what you built, but I see now that I was only holding it back. I hope you can forgive me." The wind rustled through the trees, carrying with it a sense of peace. Walter took a deep breath, feeling a small but significant weight lift from his shoulders. With the sale of the diner complete, the transformation of Harper's Grill into the Freedom Table began. Volunteers from all over the town pitched in, painting walls, rearranging furniture, and adding decorations that reflected the diner's new mission of unity and inclusion. Walter, true to his word, agreed to stay on as a cook. Though he felt out of place at first, He slowly began to find his footing. Serving customers of all backgrounds was a humbling experience, but it was also strangely fulfilling. One evening, as Walter wiped down the counters, Lila approached him with a warm smile. "Grandpa, you're doing great," she said. "I'm proud of you." Walter looked at her, his eyes filled with gratitude. "Thanks, kiddo. I'm trying." As the renovations neared completion, the town buzzed with anticipation for the Freedom Table's grand opening. For Walter, it wasn't just the beginning of a new chapter for the diner. It was the beginning of a new chapter for himself. The transformation of Harper's Grill into the Freedom Table was more than a renovation. It was a symbolic journey for the entire town of Willowbrook. What had once been a flashpoint of division and prejudice was now on the verge of becoming a beacon of unity and hope. The process was neither easy nor without resistance, but it brought together an unlikely coalition of people, each contributing their time, skills, and heart to breathe new life into the space. The decision to rename the diner came after several brainstorming sessions, led by Michael Daniels, Lila Graves, and a team of community members. Suggestions poured in from townspeople, some practical, others aspirational. It was Lila who suggested the Freedom Table. "This name embodies everything we're fighting for," she explained during a meeting. "It's not just about a meal. It's about equality, inclusion, and the idea that everyone deserves a seat at the table." The name resonated with everyone. Even Walter Graves, who initially felt a pang of loss at letting go of the family name, found solace in its meaning. His father, Henry Graves, had often said, "A table is a place for connection. If it divides, it's not a table worth having." Walter finally understood those words in a new light. Renovating the diner became a massive undertaking, but it also served as a healing process for the town. Volunteers of all ages and backgrounds showed up daily, armed with paintbrushes, toolkits, and an eagerness to contribute. The walls, once drab and uninviting, were painted in warm, welcoming tones. Local artists donated artwork that celebrated diversity and resilience, transforming the space into a visual testament to the town's new values. Michael worked tirelessly alongside the volunteers, leading by example. Lila, with her youthful energy and knack for organization, coordinated the efforts, ensuring every detail aligned with their vision. Even Walter found himself drawn into the work, his hands steady as he sanded down old furniture and repaired squeaky hinges. Though he still felt the sting of his past actions, each nail he hammered into place felt like a small step toward redemption. Not everyone in Willowbrook embraced the changes. A small but vocal group, led by a local businessman named Frank Matthews, accused Michael and his supporters of erasing tradition. "This isn't progress," Frank declared at a town meeting. "It's betrayal. The Graves family built that diner, and now you're turning it into something that doesn't represent this town." Michael remained calm in the face of criticism. "This diner isn't just about one family or one group of people," he said. "It's about creating a space where everyone feels welcome, where no one is turned away because of who they are. That's the kind of legacy worth preserving." Despite the backlash, the community's determination never wavered. For every detractor, there were 10 supporters who showed up with open hearts and helping hands. The transformation of Harper's Grill into the Freedom Table was unstoppable. One of the most significant changes was Walter's decision to stay on as a cook. Initially, he felt out of place, unsure of how to interact with customers he'd once excluded. But with gentle encouragement from Lila and Michael, he began to find his footing. His first day in the kitchen was marked by a mix of anxiety and determination. As the aroma of sizzling bacon and freshly brewed coffee filled the air, Walter focused on each dish, as if it were a work of art. When the first customers, a young interracial couple, sat down, he hesitated before stepping out of the kitchen to deliver their order. "Thank you. Welcome to the Freedom Table," Walter said, his voice trembling slightly. The couple smiled warmly, thanking him for the meal. It was a small interaction, but it marked a monumental step in Walter's journey. The diner's menu underwent a transformation as well. In addition to classic comfort food, Michael and Lila introduced dishes that reflected the cultural diversity of the community. From soul food to Mediterranean-inspired plates, the new menu celebrated the flavors of inclusion. Walter, initially skeptical of the changes, found himself experimenting with recipes he'd never considered before. With guidance from local cooks and home chefs, he mastered dishes like shrimp and grits, chicken shawarma, and tamales. To his surprise, he discovered a newfound passion for cooking that transcended tradition. "This is what food should do," he mused one evening, wiping his hands on a towel. "Bring people together." As the opening day approached, the team decided to dedicate a wall in the diner to honor the town's veterans, including Robert Daniels. The Wall of Honor featured photographs, plaques, and handwritten notes of gratitude from the community. At the center was a portrait of Robert in his military uniform, accompanied by a quote from one of his speeches. "True freedom is when everyone has a place at the table." When Robert saw the wall for the first time, he was overcome with emotion. "This means more than I can put into words," he said, his voice thick with gratitude. "Thank you for making this a place where everyone belongs." The grand opening of the Freedom Table was a momentous occasion. Crowds gathered outside the diner, the air buzzing with anticipation. A local band played uplifting tunes, and volunteers handed out flyers detailing the diner's new mission and menu. Walter stood in the kitchen, his hands trembling slightly as he prepared the first orders of the day. Lila popped her head in, flashing him an encouraging smile. "You've got this, Grandpa," she said. As the doors opened, the diner quickly filled with people of all ages and backgrounds. The atmosphere was electric, filled with laughter, conversation, and the clinking of plates and glasses. Walter found himself smiling as he worked, feeling a sense of purpose he hadn't experienced in years. Throughout the day, customers approached Walter to thank him for his efforts. One elderly woman, a longtime patron of the diner, took his hand and said, "I've lived in this town my whole life, and I never thought I'd see a day like this. Thank you for having the courage to change." Walter nodded, his eyes misty. "It wasn't easy," he admitted, "but it was worth it." By the end of the day, the Freedom Table had already begun to establish itself as more than just a diner. It was a place where the town's divisions began to heal, where people could share a meal and a story, and where the values of inclusion and unity were celebrated. As the sun set on the first day, Walter stepped outside to catch his breath. Michael joined him, the two men standing side by side, in a moment of quiet reflection. "You did good today," Michael said. Walter nodded, his gaze fixed on the glowing sign above the door. "We all did." For the first time in years, Walter felt a sense of peace. The diner was no longer just a symbol of his family's legacy. It was a symbol of hope for the future. The morning of the grand opening was unlike any other in Willowbrook. The town square buzzed with activity, the chatter of anticipation filling the crisp air. It wasn't just the launch of a diner. It was the dawn of a new chapter for the community. Banners bearing the name "The Freedom Table" hung proudly above the diner's entrance, fluttering slightly in the breeze. A red ribbon stretched across the doorway, waiting to be cut. A symbolic act to mark the transformation of a once divisive establishment into a place of unity. People began arriving long before the official opening time. The crowd was a tapestry of the town's diversity. young and old, black and white, families and individuals. Some came out of curiosity, others out of support for the cause, and a few skeptics lurked at the edges, observing from a distance. Michael Daniels stood at the forefront, his sharp suit and confident demeanor radiating leadership. Beside him was Lila Graves, whose excitement was palpable. She flitted from one task to another, ensuring everything was in place. Her mother, Margaret, helped coordinate volunteers, while Walter remained inside the kitchen, silently preparing himself for the day ahead. Walter stood at the back of the kitchen, staring at his reflection in a gleaming stainless steel refrigerator. Dressed in his chef's whites, he looked every bit the part, but inside, his nerves churned like a storm. This wasn't just about cooking. It was about facing the community he had once alienated. "Grandpa," Lila said, poking her head into the kitchen. "You ready?" Walter turned, his face betraying a mixture of anxiety and determination. "Ready as I'll ever be." Lila walked over and gave his hand a reassuring squeeze. "You've got this. And remember, this isn't just about the past. It's about what we're building now." Walter nodded, her words giving him the strength to take a deep breath and focus. Outside, the crowd fell silent as Michael stepped up to the microphone. "Today," he began, his voice steady and clear, "we're not just opening a diner. We're opening the door to a brighter future, one where everyone has a seat at the table." Applause rippled through the crowd, and Michael continued. "This transformation wouldn't have been possible without the incredible support of this community. Each of you played a part in turning a place that once symbolized division into a symbol of unity. And for that, I thank you." Lila joined Michael, holding the oversized scissors for the ribbon cutting. "Let's do this together," she said, inviting Walter to join them. The crowd murmured as Walter stepped forward, his movements deliberate, his expression solemn. He hesitated for a moment, the weight of the moment sinking in. Then, with a nod to Lila and Michael, he took the scissors and cut the ribbon. The crowd erupted in cheers, the energy electric. As the doors opened, a flood of patrons filled the diner. The atmosphere inside was warm and inviting, the renovations having transformed the space into a reflection of the town's newfound inclusivity. Tables were arranged to encourage conversation, and the walls displayed artwork celebrating the community's diversity. Robert Daniels, the guest of honor, was among the first to enter. He walked in with a quiet dignity, his every step a reminder of the resilience he embodied. Walter, standing behind the counter, felt a lump rise in his throat as their eyes met. "Welcome to the Freedom Table," Walter said, his voice trembling slightly. Robert extended a hand. "Thank you, Walter. This is a good start." The handshake between the two men was brief but powerful, a gesture that symbolized forgiveness and the beginning of reconciliation. Throughout the day, Walter found himself facing moments of personal growth. An interracial family sat at one of the booths, their young daughter beaming with excitement as she ordered pancakes. Walter hesitated before approaching their table, but as he set their plates down, the mother smiled at him warmly. "Thank you," she said. "We've heard so much about this place. It's wonderful to see it come to life." Walter nodded, managing a small smile. "I hope you enjoy your meal." Each interaction chipped away at the walls of fear and prejudice that had once defined him. With every plate he served, Walter felt a renewed sense of purpose. Midway through the day, a group of veterans entered the diner, their presence commanding respect. They made their way to a reserved table near the center of the room, their camaraderie evident in their laughter and shared stories. Walter approached cautiously, his hands gripping a tray of coffee cups. "I'd like to offer this on the house," he said, setting the cups down. As a thank you for your service. One of the veterans, a burly man with a kind smile, looked up at Walter. You've come a long way, he said. It takes courage to change. Walter nodded, his voice quiet but firm. It's never too late to do the right thing. As the day wore on, it became clear that the Freedom Table was more than just a diner. It was a space where the community's wounds began to heal. Conversations flowed easily among patrons who might not have spoken to one another before. Children played in a small corner, set up with books and games, their laughter a soundtrack to the day's success. Even skeptics who had initially stayed outside found themselves drawn in, curious about the buzz. One such man, Frank Matthews, entered near closing time. He glanced around, taking in the changes with a critical eye. Frank, Walter said, walking over. Glad you came. Frank shrugged. Figured I'd see what all the fuss is about. Walter gestured to an empty seat. Let me get you something. On the house. Frank hesitated, then sat down. I'll take a coffee. It wasn't a reconciliation, but it was a start. As the last customer left and the staff began cleaning up, Walter found himself standing in the center of the diner, surveying the space. The day had been a whirlwind, but it had also been transformative. For the first time in years, he felt a sense of peace. Michael joined him, wiping his hands on a towel. How are you feeling? Tired, Walter admitted. But good. This place, it's different now. Better. Michael smiled. It's just the beginning. Walter nodded, the truth of those words settling deep within him. The Freedom Table wasn't just a new chapter for the diner. It was a new chapter for him, for the community, and for the legacy he hoped to leave behind. The morning after the Freedom Table's successful opening, a sense of calm settled over Willowbrook. The diner's transformation had been a symbolic victory, but the real work was just beginning. For Walter Graves, it wasn't just about running the diner differently. It was about rebuilding the relationships he had damaged over years of prejudice and stubbornness. The past lingered like a heavy shadow, and Walter knew that forgiveness wouldn't come easily. The first step in Walter's journey toward reconciliation began at home. Lila sat in the living room, her laptop open, scrolling through social media posts celebrating the diner's transformation. Pictures of Walter in his chef's uniform were trending locally, with captions praising his efforts to change. Yet, as Walter approached her, he could see the guarded expression on her face, a mixture of pride and lingering disappointment. Lila, he began, his voice low. I wanted to talk to you. She closed her laptop and turned to face him. I'm listening. Walter hesitated, searching for the right words. I know I've let you down. I've said things and done things that hurt you, things I thought were about protecting our family's legacy. But I see now that I was wrong. I wasn't protecting anything. I was just holding on to my pride. Lila's gaze softened slightly, but she didn't let him off the hook easily. Grandpa, it wasn't just pride. It was hate. You didn't just hurt me. You hurt people who didn't deserve it, like Mr. Daniels. Walter nodded, her words cutting deep. I know, and I'm sorry for all of it. I can't change the past, but I want to do better. I want to make things right, with you, with the community, and with myself. Lila leaned back in her chair, studying him. Do you really mean that? I do, Walter said, his voice firm. And I'll prove it, not just with words, but with actions. For the first time in years, Lila saw a glimpse of the man her grandfather used to be. She offered him a small, tentative smile. Then, I'll give you that chance, but it's going to take time. Walter nodded, grateful for her honesty. I understand. Later that day, Walter made his way to Robert Daniels' house, a modest home on the outskirts of town. The walk up the driveway felt longer than it was, each step weighed down by the enormity of the apology he was about to offer. When Robert opened the door, he looked surprised but not hostile. "Walter," Robert said, his tone neutral. "What brings you here?" Walter removed his hat and held it in his hands. "I came to apologize, Robert, for everything." Robert's expression didn't soften, but he stepped aside to let Walter in. They sat in the living rooms, a space filled with photos of Robert's family and military memorabilia. Walter took a deep breath and began. "I was wrong," he said simply. "Not just about what happened at the diner, but about how I've lived my life. I thought I was upholding my family's legacy, but all I did was tarnish it. I disrespected you, and I disrespected the values my father built Harper's Grill on. I don't expect you to forgive me, but I needed to tell you that I'm sorry." Robert studied him for a long moment, his gaze sharp but not unkind. "Walter, you've caused a lot of pain, not just to me, but to this town. Change doesn't come easy, and neither does forgiveness. But seeing what you've done with the Freedom Table, that's a start." Walter nodded, relief washing over him. "Thank you for saying that. I'll keep working to make things right." Robert leaned forward, his tone softening. "You've got a long road ahead, Walter. But if you're willing to walk it, I'll be here." As news of Walter's apology spread, the town began to shift. Formerly divided neighbors started to reconnect, their conversations more open and honest than before. The Freedom Table became a gathering place for these discussions, its walls bearing witness to the slow but steady healing of a fractured community. One evening, a group of high school students hosted a town hall meeting at the diner, inviting residents to share their experiences with prejudice and reconciliation. Walter attended, sitting quietly in the back, as Lila and Michael moderated the discussion. A young man stood up, his voice shaking slightly. "Growing up, I always felt like I didn't belong here because of my skin color. But seeing what's happening at the Freedom Table, it gives me hope." The room erupted in applause, and Walter felt a lump rise in his throat. For the first time, he realized that his efforts weren't just about making amends. They were about building something better for the next generation. One relationship that required special attention was Walter's with his daughter, Margaret. Their conversations had grown strained over the years, especially after Margaret threatened to distance herself from him, following the incident with Robert. Now, as they sat together at the diner after hours, Walter struggled to find the words. "Margaret," he began, "I know I haven't been the father you deserved. I've been stubborn, and I've let my pride hurt you and this family. But I want to fix that." Margaret looked at him, her eyes filled with both sadness and hope. "Dad, I've waited a long time to hear you say that. I was angry because I knew you were better than this. I wanted you to see what you were doing, not just to others, but to us." "I see it now," Walter said earnestly. "And I'm sorry for all the years I wasted. I want to do better. For you, for Lila, for everyone." Margaret reached across the table and took his hand. "Then, let's start fresh, together." As the weeks passed, the Freedom Table continued to thrive. Walter found himself growing more comfortable in his role, greeting customers with a smile and engaging in conversations he never would have had before. Each interaction was a step toward rebuilding the trust he had lost. One afternoon, Robert returned to the diner with his family. Walter personally served them, his hands steady, as he placed their meals on the table. "Thank you, Walter," Robert said, his tone warm. "This place, it's becoming something special." Walter smiled, his heart swelling with gratitude. "That means a lot, Robert. Thank you." By the end of the chapter, the diner had become more than just a place to eat. It was a symbol of what the town could achieve when it came together. Walter's journey wasn't over, but the steps he had taken were a testament to the power of reconciliation. The transformation of the Freedom Table, from a symbol of division to one of unity, had sparked something larger than anyone in Willowbrook had expected. The story of the diner had traveled far beyond the town's borders, reaching communities across the state and even capturing national attention. It became clear that what had started as a local effort to make amends now had the potential to inspire broader change. News outlets began covering the story in earnest. Reporters from prominent networks arrived in Willowbrook, eager to document the remarkable journey of Walter Graves, Robert Daniels, and the community they had brought together. The diner's reopening had become a beacon of hope, a sign that reconciliation was possible, even in the most divided places. Michael Daniels found himself at the center of this growing movement. As a seasoned civil rights activist, he was no stranger to the media spotlight. However, this time felt different. This wasn't just another campaign or protest. This was personal. Standing outside the Freedom Table, during an interview with a national news anchor, Michael spoke with conviction. This isn't just about one town or one diner. It's about addressing the deep-seated biases that exist in every community. Change starts with conversations, with understanding, and with the courage to confront our own prejudices. Clips of Michael's interview went viral, sparking conversations across social media. People shared their own experiences with discrimination, some even admitting to confronting their biases for the first time. The hashtag #Freedom Table movement trended for weeks, bringing people together in unexpected ways. Michael saw the momentum as an opportunity to expand the impact of their efforts. Partnering with civil rights organizations, he organized a series of workshops and events focused on racial reconciliation, equity, and community building. These gatherings were held at the Freedom Table and in other towns, eager to learn from Willowbrook's example. The first workshop, held in the diner's newly renovated community space, was attended by a diverse group of residents. Among them were local high school students, church leaders, business owners, and even a few of Walter's former supporters, who had initially resisted the changes. Lila took on a prominent role during these sessions. Her ability to connect with younger participants made her a natural leader. She shared her perspective as someone who had stood against her own family's prejudices, emphasizing the importance of challenging harmful beliefs within close circles. "I know how hard it is to stand up to people you love," Lila told the group during one session. "But if we don't challenge these ideas, they'll keep getting passed down. Change starts at home." Her words resonated deeply, sparking thoughtful discussions among attendees. Some admitted their own struggles with prejudice, while others shared stories of courage and transformation. Walter Graves, once the most unlikely advocate for racial equality, began to find his voice in this movement. Initially hesitant to participate in the workshops, he gradually became more involved, sharing his story with small groups. His honesty about his past mistakes and his journey toward understanding struck a chord with many. At one session, Walter stood before the group, his hands clasped tightly as he spoke. "I spent most of my life thinking I was doing the right thing, protecting my family's legacy, preserving what I thought was tradition. But I see now that I was only protecting my own fears. Changing wasn't easy, and it still isn't. But if I can do it, so can anyone." The room was silent for a moment, before breaking into applause. Walter's vulnerability had transformed him from a symbol of resistance to a symbol of redemption. As word of the workshops spread, other towns reached out to Michael and his team. asking for guidance on how to address similar issues in their own communities. Soon, the Freedom Table movement began hosting events in neighboring cities, each gathering drawing larger and more diverse crowds. In one such town, a diner owner who had followed Walter's story approached him after a workshop. "Your journey gave me the courage to look at my own actions," she said, her voice trembling. "I've realized I've been turning away customers who didn't look like me, justifying it as my right. But it wasn't right. It was wrong. Thank you for showing me that it's never too late to change." Walter nodded, humbled by her words. "It's not an easy road, but it's worth it. And it's not one you have to walk alone." Back in Willowbrook, the diner continued to serve as a hub for change. Residents who had once been at odds now found themselves sitting at the same tables, sharing meals and conversations. Formerly divided families began to reconcile, inspired by Walter's willingness to make amends. One evening, Robert Daniels hosted a storytelling night at the Freedom Table. Veterans, young activists, and longtime residents took turns sharing their experiences of overcoming adversity and building bridges. Walter sat quietly in the corner, listening intently as a young black man spoke about his struggles, growing up in a town that hadn't always been welcoming. "When I was younger," the man said, his voice steady, "I used to avoid this diner because I knew I wouldn't be welcome. But today, I walked in with my head held high. That's what change looks like." The crowd erupted into applause, and Walter felt a lump rise in his throat. Moments like this reminded him why the journey was worth it. Meanwhile, Michael and Lila worked tirelessly to expand the reach of the movement. They launched an online platform where people could share their stories of reconciliation and connect with others doing similar work. The site quickly gained traction, becoming a hub for resources, discussions, and inspiration. Lila also took the lead on a new project, creating an educational program for schools that used the Freedom Table's story as a case study. The curriculum focused on teaching students about empathy, inclusion, and the importance of standing up for what's right. "Kids need to learn these lessons early," Lila explained, during a meeting with local educators. "If we can reach them now, we can create a generation that's more compassionate and understanding." One day, Walter received an unexpected invitation to speak at a state-level conference on racial reconciliation. At first, he was hesitant. The idea of standing in front of a large audience to share his story felt daunting. But with encouragement from Lila, Michael, and even Robert, he agreed. Standing on the stage, Walter took a deep breath before addressing the crowd. "I never thought I'd be here today," he began. "For most of my life, I was part of the problem. I clung to beliefs that hurt others, and I justified it as tradition. But tradition isn't an excuse for harm. It took me a long time to see that, and it wasn't easy to change. But I'm here to tell you that change is possible. It starts with listening, with opening your heart." The audience gave him a standing ovation, and Walter felt a sense of purpose he had never known before. This wasn't just about atoning for his past. It was about building a better future. By the end of the chapter, the Freedom Table movement had grown into a national phenomenon. What began as a single act of defiance by Lila Graves had blossomed into a powerful call for justice and unity. Walter, Michael, and the entire community of Willowbrook had proven that change, while difficult, was possible, and that it could start with something as simple as a shared meal. Despite the profound transformation of the Freedom Table and the overwhelming support from the community and beyond, not everyone embraced the change. Resistance simmered beneath the surface, and for some, the diner's new mission felt like an affront to their identity and beliefs. as the Freedom Table movement gained momentum nationally. The backlash in Willowbrook grew louder, testing the resilience of Robert, Michael, Walter, and the entire community. The first sign of trouble came on a quiet morning, when Walter arrived at the diner to prepare for the day. As he unlocked the doors, his heart sank at the sight of spray-painted words scrawled across the diner's exterior. "Traitor, and this isn't unity, it's betrayal." The colorful mural symbolizing the diner's new mission had been defaced with crude graffiti, an attack not just on the building, but on everything it represented. Walter stood in silence, his hands trembling, as he traced the sharp, angry letters with his eyes. This was his worst fear, that his attempt to change would provoke anger and deepen the divisions he had once perpetuated. Before long, Michael and Robert arrived, their faces darkening as they took in the scene. Robert placed a hand on Walter's shoulder. "This isn't just about you," Robert said firmly. "It's about fear. And fear only grows louder when it feels threatened." Michael nodded. "They want us to react with anger, to prove their point. But we're not going to give them that satisfaction." Word of the vandalism spread quickly, and by noon, a crowd of supporters had gathered outside the diner. With paintbrushes, cleaning supplies, and steely determination, they worked together to restore the mural and remove the hateful messages. Among them were teenagers inspired by Lila's leadership, veterans who had found solace at the diner, and families who believed in the diner's mission. Walter watched in awe as the community rallied around him, their actions reaffirming his belief that the diner had truly become a symbol of hope. In the weeks following the vandalism, tensions in Willowbrook escalated. Anonymous letters criticizing the Freedom Table began circulating, accusing it of erasing tradition and bowing to outside influences. Rumors spread that some local businesses were quietly refusing to serve those associated with the movement. At a town hall meeting, a small but vocal group of residents confronted Michael and Walter, accusing them of dividing the community. "This used to be a place where everyone knew their place," one man shouted, his face red with anger. "Now, you're turning it into something it was never meant to be." Michael remained calm, his voice steady as he responded. "We're not dividing the community. We're healing it. But healing takes time, and it's not always comfortable. What we're doing here isn't about erasing history. It's about building a better future." Walter, though still finding his footing as an advocate, surprised everyone by stepping forward. "I was part of the problem," he admitted, his voice heavy with emotion. "For years, I clung to beliefs that hurt people. But this diner was never meant to divide. It was meant to bring people together. That's what my father believed, and that's what I believe now." The room fell silent, Walter's words hanging in the air. While not everyone was convinced, his vulnerability struck a chord with many. A few people even approached him afterward to express their support, showing that hearts and minds could still be changed. The turning point came late one evening, when Walter caught two young men attempting to vandalize the diner again. He stepped out of the shadows, his voice firm but calm. "Stop right there." The men froze, their spray cans in hand. They exchanged nervous glances, but didn't run. "What are you doing this for?" Walter asked, his tone carrying more curiosity than anger. One of the men, barely out of his teens, scowled. "You sold out your own people. You're a disgrace." Walter stepped closer, his hands raised in a gesture of peace. "I thought the same way once," he admitted. "I thought changing meant losing everything I'd ever known. But I was wrong. Change doesn't erase the past. It builds on it." The young men hesitated, their expressions softening. Walter continued, his voice steady. "If you're angry, come inside. Talk to me. Tell me why." but don't destroy something that's trying to help this town heal." After a tense pause, the men dropped their spray cans and walked away. Walter watched them go, a mixture of relief and sadness washing over him. He knew there was still much work to be done, but this moment felt like a small victory. In the aftermath of the attempted vandalism, the community's resolve only strengthened. Supporters organized a day of restoration at the Freedom Table, inviting residents to help repair the diner and beautify its surroundings. The event turned into a celebration of unity, with music, food, and heartfelt speeches from Robert, Michael, and Lila. During the event, Walter stood before the crowd, his voice trembling with emotion as he addressed them. "For most of my life, I thought strength meant standing firm, never bending. But I've learned that true strength is being willing to change, to admit when you're wrong, and to build something better. This diner is more than just a building. It's a second chance for all of us." The crowd erupted into applause, and Walter felt a sense of belonging he hadn't experienced in years. As the Freedom Table movement continued to grow, so did the challenges. Threats of boycotts from nearby businesses loomed, and whispers of larger protests against the diner began to surface. Michael, ever the strategist, saw this as an opportunity to reinforce the diner's mission. "We're not going to let fear dictate our actions," he told the team during a meeting. "We'll keep moving forward, one step at a time." Robert, too, remained a steady presence, offering wisdom and guidance. "Change isn't easy," he reminded everyone, "but every step we take brings us closer to the future we're fighting for." Amid the external challenges, Walter's internal journey continued. He began volunteering at local schools, sharing his story with students and encouraging them to think critically about prejudice and tradition. His once stubborn demeanor softened, replaced by a quiet humility that inspired those around him. One day, as Walter finished speaking at a school assembly, a young boy approached him. "Mr. Graves," the boy said shyly, "I heard my dad say bad things about the diner, but I think what you're doing is really cool." Walter knelt to meet the boy's gaze, his eyes glistening. "Thank you," he said softly. "Never be afraid to stand up for what's right." By the end of the chapter, the community's resilience had begun to outshine the resistance. The diner, once a battleground for division, now stood as a testament to the power of perseverance and collective action. While challenges persisted, they only served to strengthen the bonds between those committed to building a better future. The transformation of the Freedom Table, from a symbol of division to a beacon of hope, had not only reshaped the lives of those in Willowbrook, but had also begun to ripple outwards, reaching communities far beyond. Yet, the question remained, could this change be sustained for generations to come? Could the diner's message inspire a legacy that endured, built on the foundation of reconciliation, empathy, and a willingness to evolve? Lila Graves, who had been a steady force throughout the diner's transformation, stepped into a leadership role. Her youthful energy, combined with her firm belief in justice, gave the diner a fresh sense of purpose. Lila organized monthly community events at the Freedom Table. From open mic nights, where locals could share their stories, to workshops on diversity and inclusion, each event brought together people who had once been strangers, or even adversaries, and allowed them to connect on a deeper level. One particularly moving event was a Veterans Appreciation Night, where Robert Daniels spoke about his military service and the lessons he learned on the battlefield. "Out there," he said, his voice steady but filled with emotion, "we didn't fight for skin color or for differences. We fought for each other. And that's what I see happening here. You're fighting for each other, for a future where no one is left behind." Lila watched from the back of the room, her heart swelling with pride. She knew that carrying forward the Freedom Table's mission wasn't just about honoring her family or her town. It was about paving the way for a better world. Meanwhile, Robert found himself in the national spotlight, invited to speak at conferences and universities about his experiences. He became a living symbol of resilience, his words resonating with audiences of all backgrounds. During a keynote speech at a major civil rights summit, Robert shared, "Forgiveness isn't about forgetting. It's about freeing yourself from the chains of anger and bitterness. It's about choosing to believe in the possibility of change, even when it feels impossible." The audience erupted into applause, moved by Robert's message. After the speech, a young woman approached him with tears in her eyes. "My father is a lot like Walter used to be," she admitted. "But hearing your story gives me hope that he can change too." Robert placed a comforting hand on her shoulder. "He can," he said simply. "It starts with someone willing to plant the seed." In Willowbrook, the diner had become a central gathering place, fostering connections that transcended old divisions. Former adversaries now worked side by side, sharing laughter and stories over meals. One day, Walter found himself sitting at a table with Paul Rogers, his old friend, who had once tried to warn him about the consequences of his stubbornness. Paul smiled warmly at Walter. "You've come a long way, my friend," he said. "I'm proud of you." Walter chuckled, a trace of his old gruffness still evident. "Took me long enough, didn't it?" Their laughter echoed through the diner, a sound that symbolized how far they and the town had come. As the Freedom Table approached its one-year anniversary, under its new identity, Lila and Michael decided to hold a celebration. The event was not just a party. It was a chance to reflect on the journey and honor everyone who had played a role in the diner's transformation. The evening began with a heartfelt speech from Michael, who recounted the struggles and triumphs of the past year. "This diner is more than just a place to eat," he said. "It's a reminder that change is possible, that reconciliation is worth fighting for, and that together we can build a legacy of love and justice." Robert followed, sharing his gratitude for the community's support. "When I walked into this diner a year ago, I felt like an outsider in my own hometown. Today, I stand here as part of a family that includes all of you." As the speeches concluded, the crowd erupted into applause, their cheers echoing into the night. News of the anniversary celebration spread, drawing attention from national media. Articles and documentaries highlighted the diner's transformation, framing it as a model for communities grappling with division. One journalist wrote, "The Freedom Table is more than just a diner. It's a blueprint for what reconciliation can look like." Its story proves that even the most entrenched divides can be bridged when people are willing to listen, learn, and change. Visitors from across the country began making pilgrimages to Willowbrook, eager to experience the diner for themselves. Some came to meet Robert, Michael, and Walter, while others simply wanted to feel the warmth and inclusivity that the diner had become known for. For Walter, the journey of self-reflection and growth continued. He had become a sought-after speaker, sharing his story of transformation with audiences across the country. But his proudest moments were those spent in the diner, working alongside his granddaughter and watching her lead with grace and determination. One day, while preparing meals in the kitchen, Walter paused to watch Lila, speaking with a group of high school students who had come to volunteer. Her words were filled with passion and conviction, and Walter felt a swell of pride. "She's going to do great things," he thought to himself. "She already is." As the chapter drew to a close, Lila announced a new initiative, a scholarship program funded by proceeds from the diner. The scholarships would support local students pursuing careers in social justice, community development, and other fields that aligned with the diner's mission. The first recipient was a young woman named Maria, who had been inspired by Lila's leadership and Robert's story. During the scholarship ceremony, Maria spoke through tears. "This diner didn't just change Willowbrook, it changed me, and I promise to carry its message wherever I go." The room filled with applause as Maria accepted her scholarship, symbolizing the next chapter in the Freedom Table's story, a chapter written by the next generation. As the sun set on Willowbrook, the diner buzzed with activity, its tables filled with laughter and conversation. Walter stood at the counter, watching the scene unfold. For the first time in years, he felt at peace. The morning sun rose over Willowbrook, casting a golden glow on the Freedom Table. The diner's once faded sign had been replaced with a bright, bold emblem symbolizing unity and reconciliation. Inside, the buzz of activity began as the staff prepared for another busy day. Yet today felt different. There was a sense of closure, a full-circle moment for everyone involved. Walter Graves sat alone at one of the tables before the diner opened. He traced the polished wood with his fingers, his eyes wandering over the photographs on the wall. Among them was an old picture of his father, standing proudly outside the original Harper's Grill, a sign that read, "Everyone welcome." That's what he wanted all along, Walter murmured to himself, a place where everyone could feel at home. The journey had been long and painful, but Walter finally understood. For years, he had clung to a false sense of pride, mistaking tradition for stubbornness and exclusion. But now, sitting in this transformed diner, surrounded by the legacy of change, he felt something he hadn't experienced in years: peace. Lila entered the diner, her arms full of freshly baked pastries. She noticed her grandfather sitting quietly and approached him with a warm smile. "Grandpa," she said softly, placing a hand on his shoulder. "It's almost time." Walter looked up at her, his eyes filled with a mixture of pride and gratitude. "You've done more for this place than I ever could, Lila," he said. "Your courage, it's what brought us here." Lila knelt beside him, her expression earnest. "We did this together, Grandpa. None of this would have been possible without your decision to change. That's the real legacy." As the two shared a quiet moment, Margaret Groves, Lila's mother, entered the diner. She hesitated for a moment before walking over, her expression softening as she saw Walter. "Dad," she said, her voice trembling slightly, "I'm proud of you. I know it wasn't easy, but you've shown us what it means to grow." Walter stood, pulling his daughter into a heartfelt embrace. "Thank you, Margaret," he said. "I hope I've earned your trust again." Later that morning, Robert Daniels arrived at the diner, greeted by a wave of cheers from the staff and customers. He was a familiar face at the Freedom Table now, a respected figure whose story had inspired so many. Walter approached him, his steps hesitant, but resolute. "Robert," he began, extending a hand, "thank you for believing in me, even when I didn't deserve it." Robert shook his hand firmly, a warm smile on his face. "We all have the capacity to change, Walter. You've proven that. And this diner, it's a testament to what's possible when we choose love over hate." The two men sat together, sharing stories of their pasts, one as a veteran who had fought for freedom, the other as a man who had finally learned its true meaning. Their conversation was not just a reconciliation, but a celebration of the bond they had forged through understanding. That evening, the town gathered outside the diner for a special ceremony. Michael Daniels stood at the front, his presence commanding but welcoming. The crowd buzzed with anticipation as he stepped up to the microphone. "Tonight," Michael began. "We honor a journey of growth, of forgiveness, and of hope. The Freedom Table is more than just a diner. It's a symbol of what we can achieve when we face our mistakes and choose to do better." He gestured to Walter, who stepped forward, visibly moved. "Walter Graves," Michael continued, "you have shown us that it's never too late to change. Your courage to confront your past has set an example for us all." The crowd erupted into applause as Walter took the microphone. He hesitated for a moment, looking out at the sea of faces, some familiar, some new. "I don't have all the answers," he admitted, his voice steady but emotional. "But I've learned that the most important thing we can do is listen. To each other, to our hearts, and to the values that truly matter. This diner is no longer just mine. It belongs to all of us." Over the next few months, the legacy of the Freedom Table continued to grow. The diner became a model for other communities, inspiring similar transformations across the country. News outlets shared its story, highlighting how a small-town diner had sparked a national conversation about reconciliation and unity. Visitors from all over came to experience the magic of the Freedom Table. They weren't just drawn by the food, but by the spirit of the place, the sense of belonging that radiated from its walls. One visitor, a high school teacher from a neighboring town, summed it up perfectly. "This isn't just a diner. It's a lesson, a reminder that change starts with each of us." Years later, Walter sat at his usual table, watching as Lila managed the diner with grace and confidence. She was the heart of the Freedom Table now, ensuring its values endured for generations. As Walter reflected on his journey, he felt a profound sense of gratitude. He had made mistakes, ones that had hurt others deeply, but he had also been given the chance to make amends, to rebuild what he had broken. Legacy isn't about holding on to the past, Walter thought. It's about creating a future we can all be proud of. The story of the Freedom Table ends with a call to action for everyone, to reflect on their own biases, to seek understanding, and to choose compassion over division. It reminds us that reconciliation is not a destination but a journey, one that requires courage, humility, and an open heart. As the final scene fades, the words appear. Change begins with each of us. What will your legacy be? As the story of the Freedom Table comes to an end, we're left with a powerful reminder. No matter how far we've strayed, or how deeply rooted our mistakes are, it's never too late to change. Walter's journey shows us that reconciliation isn't easy, but it's worth it. For our families, our communities, and ourselves. Now, it's your turn. What did this story mean to you? Have you ever experienced or witnessed a moment of transformation like Walter's? Share your thoughts in the comments below. We'd love to hear your perspective, and don't stop here. If this story moved you, if it made you think about the power of forgiveness and courage, make sure to hit that subscribe button. There's so much more to come, and we'd love for you to be part of the journey. Together, let's keep sharing stories that inspire, challenge, and remind us of the best in humanity. Stay tuned for the next chapter. It might just be the story that changes everything.